Since it's Halloween and all, I figure it's only natural to check out some super spooky retro games. So today we'll be taking a look at Swamp Thing on the NES. For those of you wondering what the hell a Swamp Thing is, it was a B-movie classic from the 80s. Essentially, a scientist gets some swamp DNA on him or something and turns into a mutant with the power of the swamp.
Here comes trouble.
Honestly, it's been a long time since I've even seen the movie, but it was fairly popular, I guess, spawning all sorts of sequels, toys, and even a cartoon with the intro set to the tune of Wild Thing.
Swamp Thing, you are amazing.
It also ended up with an NES game because of course it did. So let's all get cozy next to the fireplace, turn off the lights, and see just how scary Swamp Thing is for the NES. Load up Swamp Thing and you're greeted with what appears to be a California raisin that's seen far better days. The story's something about how he wants to make an army of superhumans, unmen, to take over the world with. To do so, all that stands in his way is Swamp Thing, everyone's favorite swamp-covered mutant. He needs to capture Swamp Thing and harvest whatever it is in him that makes him so damn cool. Then the game just kinda dumps you right into the stage without even so much as a stage 1 screen. It's actually quite jarring for some reason. Playing Swamp Thing is probably worse than actually being Swamp Thing. The game tries to be your standard 2D side-scrolling platform action game like so many other NES games out there, but fails in just about every single aspect. Swamp Thing can move left or right, jump, punch, and shoot slime balls if you get the power up. It's not the largest moveset of all time, but adequate enough for an NES game. It's just that Swamp Thing doesn't actually do anything good. Swamp Thing himself is as slow as a creature that's literally made out of swamp parts probably should be. The guy just doesn't move very fast. This wouldn't be so bad if it weren't for the constant stream of enemies exploding out of things right next to you. You literally have zero time to react before something's hitting you, like this ghost knife that just sort of appears out of nowhere behind you, or these fish things that just don't give a shit about being fair at all and jump out of the water when you're right on top of them. You just have to slowly inch your way forward to make sure something isn't going to suddenly jump out at you, and even then, that doesn't work all the time. This is no way to play a game, it's just painful. Speaking of the enemies, they can all go straight to hell. First off, I apologize for not showing anything more than the first stage of this game. The main reason being because of these pile of shit enemies. Every single one of them is programmed with a maximum amount of hatred for the player. I already mentioned ghost knives and robot fish, but you also get robot possums that do nothing but go back and forth on platforms, which should be easy enough to dodge, but somehow no matter how well you time your jump, they'll hit you almost every single time. How about giant robot mosquitoes that slowly descend on top of you with no way to jump over them? Your only way to avoid them is to hope that they pass over top of you, or if you can manage to run away from them. But even then, there's no guarantee that'll work since Satan himself programmed these assholes. Sometimes they'll be fine just going right over the top of you, and other times they'll break their own rules and come down even further, making you take a hit. This is hell. Oh, and let's not forget these things. I don't even know what they are. They just kind of float on top of the water. Are they sharp cans or something? Did someone actually put a sharpened, tossed away can in the game as an enemy? I really think they did, and this is only the first level. So, Swamp Thing already has the odds stacked against him with shit movement and cheap enemies all over the place. That means he's got some awesome attack powers to fight back with, right? Oh, god no. Swamp Thing's standard punch does almost nothing. It barely travels any distance at all and usually gets you hurt in the process of trying to kill anything. You can't even punch while you're ducking. You're better off just avoiding enemies entirely, especially since more often than not, they're completely invulnerable to the punch. You really never know which enemies you can hurt and ones you can't until they've hit you 2 or 3 times. Why even put an attack in the game if it's this useless? What evil monster could come up with this stuff? Was it this guy? I don't know, but it sucks. It turns what I'm gathering is supposed to be an action game into nothing more than carefully dodging and jumping over enemies without anything to clear a path with. Well, I shouldn't say anything. You do get a ball of swamp goo that you can throw as a power-up, but you only have a limited supply you can use, and even then, as with the punch, most of the worst enemies are invulnerable to it, so why even bother? You're just going to have to accept that Swamp Thing is mostly powerless, and get used to jumping and dodging your way through levels. That's about all I can muster for Swamp Thing. I generally try to play through these games for review, but Swamp Thing broke me after just one stage. I did eventually make it to the second stage, but it's just more of the same cheap bullshit from the first stage. The game is literally nothing more than memorizing every single stage and jump until you can make it through, and I just don't have that kind of patience for shit anymore. Obviously, I can't recommend that anyone play Swamp Thing on the NES. I'd actually recommend running the opposite direction if you ever see it out in the wild. This is nothing anyone should ever subject themselves to, and probably one of the worst NES games out there. Still though, if you're looking for something that will cause screams of terror and fright from your friends this Halloween, well, Swamp Thing may be your game. A while back in one of these reviews, I mentioned how amazing it was to own a Game Boy and finally be able to play console-quality games right in the palm of your hand. Game Boy games like Contra was, for the most part, just as good as its console big brother, and even that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game was pretty fun as well. Even if they did seem scaled back from a full-on NES release, you could still easily give them a pass for finally being portable versions of great games that were, up until that point, hardwired to your TV. It was an amazing thing to me as a kid that never seemed to get old, so it was an almost complete no-brainer purchase when the Castlevania Adventure first appeared on shelves for the Game Boy. The original NES Castlevania being one of my favorite games of all time, so there was no way I was going to pass this up. Plus, if Konami could make a pretty damn good version of Contra on the Game Boy, how could they possibly screw up Castlevania, right? Spoiler alert, they totally screwed up Castlevania. For the most part, it looks like the game got the basics right. You still get a 2D side-scrolling game that focuses on killing horrific beasts of the night while you find your way through the levels, fighting a boss at the end of each one. Add in some platforming sections and you've got yourself a Castlevania game, or so you'd think. Right from the second you press start though, you can instantly tell something went really wrong with this game. First and foremost, this is Castlevania in name only. Most everything that made Castlevania so great on the NES is completely tossed out for the most part. Sure, you still play as a guy with a whip as his main weapon, but that's about it. All those cool power-ups from the NES game are nowhere to be seen here. Instead, the most you can do is upgrade your whip via power orbs. You can power up the whip twice, which gives you a projectile attack when you get it to maximum power. The only other thing that even resembles a power-up is a cross that gives you invincibility for a few seconds. So if you were hoping for the same Castlevania experience that you had on the NES, well, this should be your first sign that you're in for a fair bit of disappointment. Even if they did remove the power-ups, the game could still be saved if the gameplay was spot on, right? Well, sure, but they managed to even fuck that up somehow. You still get the heavy character physics that made those NES platforming sections so notoriously hard, but everything else feels completely off. First of all, the game moves at an impossibly slow pace. Seriously, it's like someone was using one of those NES controllers that lets you enable slow motion. Except it's not, it's just how the game actually moves. The original NES game was by no means a super fast-paced game, but it at least ran fast and smooth, along with having extremely responsive controls. The Castlevania Adventure doesn't even come close, and constantly feels like you're trudging through molasses. It makes basic jumps and timing your attacks almost impossible, since you'll be getting hit before your character can even start to attack. Everything you try to do feels delayed, and for a game that requires fast reflexes and accurate jumps, you'll probably be tossing your Game Boy across the room in a matter of minutes trying to do anything with this game. The Castlevania Adventure doesn't even stop there at being awful either. It continues to insult any previous Castlevania player by throwing most of the NES game's rules right out the window. Remember hearts on the NES game? The more you had, the more you could use your special weapon. In the Castlevania Adventure though, they refill your health bar instead. It's so confusing the first time you play the game, since you just expect it to follow the same rules as the previous game. Why couldn't they have just used chicken legs like in the NES game? Why hearts when we've already conditioned ourselves to think they're for something completely different? Even more damning though is how your whip downgrades. In the NES game, if you powered your whip up, you had it until you died. After that, it was up to you to power it up again. Seems pretty fair, right? Well, in the Castlevania Adventure, your whip downgrades every time you get hit. Every single time. And in a game that controls this badly with super cheap enemies around every corner, having a fully powered up whip for more than a few seconds is almost impossible. So you better just get used to using the crappy standard whip, since that's what you'll be stuck with 90% of the game. I guess it's also worth mentioning that the game is insanely hard as well. Obviously Castlevania is known for its challenge, but not this kind of challenge. You'll be taking cheap hits left and right with no way of being able to dodge them or react due to the sluggish controls. The game only has 4 stages total, so you could probably still eventually beat it if you're some kind of masochist. But there are far better Castlevania games out there to lose your sanity to, so I'm not sure why anyone would even bother. All said, the Castlevania Adventure is an awful game, and an even bigger disappointment. This was finally our chance to have a portable Castlevania game, and instead we just got an unplayable mess that seems to do a better job of making sure no one would ever want to play another Castlevania game ever again. Having a Game Boy was definitely great, but games like the Castlevania Adventure showed how badly someone could ruin the experience of playing a portable version of your favorite console game. All this game made you want to do was turn the Game Boy off and play the far better NES game, and that's exactly what I recommend doing here. Super Adventure Island was released not too long after the Super NES hit North American shores, and it was one of the first big sequels to come over from the NES that wasn't Mario. The original Adventure Island was already fairly popular on the NES, with 2 awesome games under its belt, so it was no wonder that there were more than a few fans eagerly anticipating Master Higgins' debut on the Super NES. Unfortunately though, the game was never well received by fans of the NES games. But does that mean it's terrible? Well, let's sit down and see just what Super Adventure Island's all about. Super Adventure Island starts off with Master Higgins sitting on top of a really tall rock with his Superfly Honey. His evening of vertigo-inducing romance is quickly cut short when a totally jealous wizard appears and turns his girl into stone. Master Higgins immediately descends into suicidal depression, flinging himself off the rock to the hard, cold earth below, instantly killing himself on impact. And then the game begins. Once in control of Master Higgins, you'll be met with a fairly standard 2D platformer. The core idea of the game is to jump and murder your way through stages before your health meter runs out, which is constantly depleting as you go through the stage. Collecting fruits along the way will only regain a bar or 2, so you have to keep moving if you want to make it to the end of each stage. Standing in the way of your goal are a few enemies here and there, but most are easily dispatched with Higgins' trusty axe or boomerang. You can power up these weapons by collecting more of the same weapon, allowing you to throw out more at the same time, and eventually turning them into fireball weapons if you collect enough of them. Overall, it's a fun game to play, and it controls well to boot, so just why did everyone hate on the game so much back in the day? Well, as mentioned earlier, the original Adventure Island already had 2 games on the NES out, both of which offered more and varied gameplay than this brand new next-gen version of Adventure Island. Adventure Island 2 even featured a Mario 3-like map, along with rideable dinosaur friends. So going from that to Super Adventure Island felt like a downgrade, especially when you figure in that this game only offered up 5 worlds total, all of which can be beaten in just a few minutes after a couple of playthroughs. And that's honestly all you'll need, since the game doesn't offer up much of a challenge beyond one-hit kills and memorizing where enemies are, and the occasional boss fight. It also suffers from cheap enemy and platform placement, and the axe weapon is all but worthless compared to the boomerang, sometimes forcing you into using it when you've already got a fully charged boomerang. It's just not good enough to stand up against even the first game on the NES, let alone its sequel, and that's really unfortunate, since I personally think the game is entirely enjoyable. One thing no one can argue with, however, is the quality of the music. It's seriously great, and almost made my jaw drop the first time I heard those funky stage beats. Going from the NES sound chip to this was truly the leap you would expect from a brand new console. It also didn't hurt that the man responsible for the music was none other than Yuzo Koshiro, who would go on to become one of the most famous video game composers of all time. If you've never heard of him, you probably know him as the guy that did the legendary Streets of Rage 2 soundtrack. Seriously, look the guy up. His early work on the Super NES and Genesis is incredible. Even if I enjoy Super Adventure Island, it's not what I'd call an all-time classic Super NES game by any means. But it's totally still fun to sit down and play for a bit. Sure, it can't hold a candle to the NES Adventure Island games, but Super Adventure Island is fun in its own way. It's a fast-paced game and generally doesn't waste your time. The stages are just short and challenging enough that it has that just one more try mentality to it, and I think that's a hell of a compliment for just about any game. So maybe don't go onto Super Adventure Island expecting the next great Adventure Island game. But take it on its own terms, and I think this is a game that you'll get hooked on pretty fast. And at the very least, you get to listen to that awesome soundtrack. When Virtua Racing first hit arcades back in 1992, it was unlike anything we'd ever seen. There may have been polygonal racers before it, namely Hard Drivin' by Atari, but Virtua Racing was on a whole different level. The awesome, albeit simple, 3D graphics moved at a super smooth frame rate, giving a sense of speed that no other racing game at the time could touch. It was also super fun to play, and drew crowds to it no matter where an arcade cabinet was. I actually first played Virtua Racing at a local Walmart as a kid, and nearly shit my pants doing so. Imagine going from something like this to this. It was a huge leap, not only in technology, but also how you played a racing game. No longer were you racing on a 2D plane, dodging cars and scenery that scaled toward you. Now the entire course, your car, and your opponents were all rendered in glorious 3D. It was truly a game changer, and instantly changed the landscape of arcade racing games. And that was all fine and well for the arcades, but us kids with home consoles basically dashed any hope of seeing anything like Virtua Racing on our puny Genesis consoles. Most of us figured we'd have to wait until Sega's true next-gen system to play anything approaching Virtua Racing. Amazingly enough though, Sega had one hell of a surprise left up its sleeve for the aging Genesis, as they announced Virtua Racing was coming home years before it would ever see a true next-gen release. But there's no way Sega could ever bring something like Virtua Racing to a console that could barely run Hard Drivin' beyond 3 frames per second, right? How many pounds of cocaine was Sega snorting at the time to think this was even possible? Well, apparently a lot, since they somehow pulled it off. In 1994, Virtua Racing hit the Genesis and managed to bring just about everything from the arcade to your living room. Obviously, it doesn't look anywhere near as good as the arcade, but it actually runs really well. Fears of frame rates in the single digits went right out the window as soon as a race began, as you're treated to a fully functional version of Virtua Racing, complete with all 3 tracks from the arcade and the same amount of opponents to race against. It was fairly shocking to even see the game running for the first time. Most kids just assumed this was running on the successor to the Genesis, or required some sort of add-on. Amazingly enough though, all you needed was your standard Genesis console to play it. If you've never played Virtua Racing before, it's about as much of an arcade racer as it can possibly be. Basically, you'll only ever be using your brakes as a last resort, as you'll be barreling through courses at breakneck speeds. Your goal is not only to place first at the end of each race, but to also race through each checkpoint, ensuring that you continue to have enough time to finish the race. Run out of time and it's game over. There's also no real danger in wrecking your car here, as the most you can manage to do is flip it after a particularly hard hit. Overall, it's super simple to play, and translates to the Genesis surprisingly well. Using the controller to turn can be a bit twitchy, but you get used to it fairly quickly. Probably the biggest issue with playing it on the Genesis is that most of the closer camera angles are hard to use due to the super low resolution of the game. It can be hard to see around polygons so jagged that they could probably slice a car in half. Sticking with the higher views is perfectly playable though, especially for a 3D Genesis game. So just how the hell can a 16-bit console pushing nearly 6 years on the market manage this? Well, much like the Super NES had the Super FX chip to power games like Star Fox, Sega made its own 3D chip called the Sega Virtual Processor. Essentially, it's a chip on a chip that allowed the Genesis to produce some fairly impressive 3D graphics. It was a hell of a feat for Sega to engineer and deliver, but it came at a pretty big cost. Mainly that the chip was expensive to produce, which in turn made Virtua Racing hit store shelves with an underwear-splitting $100 price tag. This all but killed sales of Virtua Racing instantly, which sucks because what Sega was able to do with this game was far more impressive than anything Nintendo ever managed to do with the Super FX chip. Sadly, Virtua Racing was the only game to ever use the Virtual Processor, and was killed off shortly after Virtua Racing's release. While Virtua Racing may be a great port from the arcade game, and a technical wonder on the Genesis, it goes without saying there are currently far better versions of Virtua Racing to play these days. You can find it on everything from the 32X to the PlayStation 2, with versions that look way better and offer more content. That sadly leaves the Genesis version as more of a curiosity than anything else. It's fun to pick up and play just to see what was possible on the Genesis, but probably not for too long before you start wanting to play the far superior versions released on more modern consoles. Still though, it's worth checking out if you see it anywhere cheap. Surprisingly, even though the game released at such a high price tag and barely sold, you can grab it these days for around $10. And if you can find it for that amount, I'd totally recommend it. Not only do you get the best racing game ever made on the Genesis, but you also get a cool piece of history as well. Virtua Racing may not have aged as well as other Sega arcade games like Daytona USA, but it's still one of the most important racing games ever made. And that's even more impressive when you're playing it on your Sega Genesis. You know, it's actually been a while since we've done a review of a good old-fashioned brawler on here. So this week, we're going to take a look at Ninja Warriors for the Super NES, a sort of remake of the original Ninja Warriors game released in arcades way back in 1987. The original game was unique in how it displayed the game, using a projector to give the game an ultra-widescreen look that came from 3 separate monitors. Seriously, there's nothing wrong with your TV here, that's just how the game looked when it was released in arcades back then. It played pretty close to stuff like Shinobi and Bad Dudes, which is to say it was a fairly basic side-scrolling beat-em-up. You walk to the right and punch some guys in the face, wax and repeat until the credits roll, or you ran out of quarters. It wasn't bad at all, but it just saw a limited release due to the more expensive cabinet setup compared to other games that didn't require fancy projection screens. It ultimately got a few ports here and there to home consoles, most notably the TurboGrafx, but by and large it was mostly forgotten well before 1990 rolled around. So I guess it made perfect sense to someone at Taito to bring Ninja Warriors back in 1994, exclusively for the Super NES as a reimagined version of the original game that everyone had forgotten by then. So does this Super NES remake live up to the original at all, or does it fall on its own cyber katana? Well, stick around and I'm sure we'll figure it out by the time this video's over. Start the game up and you're treated with an intro cutscene trying to explain why you're using cybernetic Terminator ninjas to kill hordes of identical-looking military troops. Something about a president gone mad with power, and the only option is, of course, to take him down with robot ninjas. It really doesn't matter since it just seems like the core concept of this game was nothing more than someone being like, hey, robot ninjas are way cool, and then they just kind of made a game about that. I guess I can't really fault that train of logic since I'd probably be doing the same thing right now if I could. Anyway, after the intro, you get to select between 3 different ninjas, all of which play fairly different. Of course, the big ninja's slow but powerful and uses his brute force to overpower enemies instead of speed and finesse like the other 2 ninjas use. Speaking of which, the girl's probably the best balanced overall, and has some awesome jump kick moves, but she's got a super short range of attack. The skinny, weird-looking ninja's the fastest of the 3 and uses his arm scythes to mow down just about anything around him, but he takes the most damage out of all 3 ninjas. It's actually pretty surprising how different each ninja feels compared to other games like this that are full of mostly palette-swapped characters that don't change the game at all. Here each character feels totally unique, and each require their own strategies to excel, and they're all super fun to play as well. Just kinda makes me wonder why it was so hard for just about every other brawler back then to figure this out. Once you're finally able to get into the game and start ninjaing shit up, you're met with a standard walk to the right brawler that the original Ninja Warriors game did so well way back in 1987. It's just a lot faster and better looking now. And no matter what ninja you chose back at that character select screen, they all just have one standard attack button and jump button at their disposal to take on the guys that are running straight at you now. That doesn't mean they're limited in what they can all do though. You can punch enemy faces with your default weapon in a variety of different ways, or you can use your leaping attacks just to jump all over the screen like just about any crazy ninja would. You can also grab opponents and shove or throw them into other enemies to clear things out a bit, along with picking up and throwing stuff like an entire motorcycle. Each character also gets a super move to use that's constantly charging at the bottom of the screen when you're not getting hit. If it charges up all the way, you can unleash a screen-clearing super ninja fart that decimates everything nearby. If you start taking hits though, the bar just drops back down to 0 and you have to start charging it all over again. It's not too big of a problem though, since the bar charges decently fast, so you'll be using your super move far more in this game than probably just about any other brawler you've ever played. And that's actually kind of cool, since it seems this game isn't actually punishing you for wanting to use your super cool attacks. Overall, Ninja Warriors is really fun to play. It's fast and fun enough to hold your attention all the way to the end of the game, but I guess that's not really saying much, since it won't take you very long to get there. Yes, much like just about every other brawler back in the day, Ninja Warriors isn't very long. You get about 8 stages to punch and kick your way through, but none will probably last longer than about 10 minutes. The challenge won't be stopping your progress much either, since the game isn't very hard at all. So theoretically, you could play through the entire game with each ninja and probably not break 3 hours doing so. That's not what you want to hear when you've just spent $60 on a game. I guess at least all the ninjas play differently enough to make each playthrough feel significantly different, and that's really great and all, but it's not enough to keep you coming back for much more than maybe a couple of playthroughs. There isn't even a 2-player co-op mode here to keep things interesting if one of your friends decides to come over. It sucks too, because I think Ninja Warriors is a really great game, while it lasts anyway. Overall, Ninja Warriors is a great Super NES exclusive brawler that just about everybody missed out on because it came out so late in the Super NES's lifespan. By the time 1994 rolled around, everyone was kind of just starting to get excited for new consoles coming out soon. So not even badass Ninja Terminators could get kids to turn their heads. Sadly, Ninja Warriors languished on store shelves, and that was the last anyone heard from the series. But that doesn't mean you still have to ignore it. While I wouldn't suggest trying to buy a physical copy since it's going for well over $100 on eBay these days for just the cartridge, you can always fire it up on your Super NES emulator of choice to get a taste of some great classic ninja action. So check out Ninja Warriors if you get a chance. It's not too long and it looks great. It plays even better. Plus, the idea of playing as a murdering death machine dressed up like a ninja never really gets old. At least to me it doesn't.